Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. My name is Wes Rice and I chair a set of software conferences called QCon, and I'm also the host of the InfoQ podcast. Today on the InfoQ podcast, we are talking to Arun Gupta. Arun is a technology enthusiast, avid runner, author of a best-selling book, Globetrotter, a community guide, Java champion, Java 1 rockstar, Jug leader, Minecraft modder, DevOps for Kidzer, Docker captain, and principal open source technologist at Amazon Web Services. I almost got through that with one breath. He has built and led communities for the past 12 years at Sun, Oracle, Red Hat, and Couchbase. In fact, I'm about 95% sure that everything I knew about Glassfish and kind of the 2007 timeframe came from talking to him, watching videos of him. I don't even know if I ever met him at that point, but I'm pretty sure it all came from him. So in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about running containers on AWS. So we're going to talk a bit about Elastic Container, or ECS. We're going to talk about Amazon Kubernetes service. We're going to talk about AWS Fargate, and we're talking about all things container. So it's a great podcast. I hope you enjoy it. Arun, welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Thank you, Wes. I'm excited to be here, and that's quite an introduction. Glassfish definitely brings sweet memories.
Very serious. I think everything I learned about Glassfish in that time frame was pretty much from watching videos or going to talks that you did at some point. So my 2007 self says thank you.
I'm humbled. I've been writing, blogging, speaking for many years now. And every time I hear that comment, to date, it still excites me that, what, something I did was right and people found it useful. That's good to know.
Last year sometime you moved from Couchbase to AWS. That was pretty soon, within a month or two of Adrian Cockcroft joining AWS. What's the connection there?
Yeah, not a month or so, but a few months after. But funny it is, about a couple of years back, I've known Adrian for a long time. We used to work together at Sun. But then a couple of years back, we were at Stockholm Airport taking a train to the Orlando Express to the Orlando Central. And then I was sitting right next to him in the train seeking career counseling. And I took him out for a lunch that, Adrian, here is my career. Here is what I want to do. And then 2016 reInvent, he says, Arun, I'm part of AWS now. And I am building a team. When I have a rec, I will let you know. And there it is. He opened up a rec in April. The whole thing end to end moved really fast, actually. In about Thursday through, the rec opened up quickly, interview loop, offer, and boom, in a week or so, I was very impressed with the quality of the recruitment that happened for me.
It was pretty quick. It seemed like too much of a tight timeline for it to be a pure coincidence.
Yeah.
All right. So your title at AWS is Principal Open Source Technologist. What does that mean? What are you focused on?
As we discussed earlier, Adrian has a team under him, that are people, focus on different verticals. As a Principal Open Source Technologist, I am particularly focused on containers and serverless. Those are the two hot areas that a lot of our customers are interested in. Well, my particular role is to build strategy around open source, around containers and serverless. So one of the very first things I did when I came to Amazon was helped us get on board at CNCF. So I'm also the board representative from Amazon, along with Adrian, on the CNCF board. So I'm responsible for the CNCF strategy within Amazon, liaison between the different service teams and the different projects, and how they need to correlate, make sure we are well represented in the working groups. It's kind of, chop woods and carry water for the open source community and Amazon together.
So what's the day look like for you these days?
A typical day would look like a lot of my job requires a hands-on coding. So I do a lot of coding, actually. It could be anywhere from building a Docker image to spinning up a EKS cluster to setting up an Istio, a service mesh, or playing with some other fun projects. A lot of it is writing. A lot of it is reviewing the blogs that our partners, our customers, our SAs, solution architects are writing, so that we make sure that the voice gets out. Interaction on social media, because we are an outbound facing team. Also creating conference abstracts, submitting to them. And typically I go with the thought process that the abstract is merit-based approved as opposed to a sponsorship tied. So a lot of it kind of goes hand in hand. On a particular day, I might be doing something more, something less.
You've mentioned Kubernetes and you've mentioned containers quite a bit, and that's kind of the focus of what I wanted to spend this time with on this podcast. So there's 3 container environments that at least I'm aware of that you can run on AWS. So there are Amazon Container Service, ECS, there are Amazon Kubernetes Services, EKS, which was just fairly recently formally released or fully public released, and then AWS Fargate. Can you kind of break each down and kind of talk a bit about when you might use one versus the other?
Absolutely. in addition to those three managed services, well, first of all, ECS and EKS are the managed services. Fargate is only a technology on how the cluster is being provisioned, essentially. So that's the way we look at it. And in addition, there is also a managed service called as ECR, or Elastic Container Registry, which is similar to like Docker Hub, where you have your registry running in the Amazon cloud itself. So those are sort of the four key components that you want to understand.
Fargate actually provisions on ECS or EKS, right?
Correct. So now if we look at ECS and EKS to begin with, those are the managed services. ECS was launched in 2015, essentially, or 2014, actually, because then Docker was hot. There were no orchestration frameworks. Kubernetes was not open source at that point of time. But our customers were asking to give us something where they can manage the orchestration of the containers. That's the reason, ECS was launched. And it's very successful today. Hundreds of millions of containers are launched on ECS every week. Lots of container instances, spinning up over there. If a customer is all in, it makes sense for them, where they don't care about what is the underlying orchestration platform. They want a deep integration with AWS services, things like CloudWatch, CloudTrail, you name it, all of those integrations. They need HIPAA compliance, they need PCI compliant, all those compliance. Then ECS is a good choice. And that's the reason, if you think about it, Code Build or SageMaker, these are the services, up-level services that are built on top of ECS. So that's the angle where they don't care about, I don't need to run anything on-premise. Everything is, in the cloud. ECS is a really good choice.
So that's when specifically you're not bringing your own orchestrator. You want Amazon to orchestrate the containers.
Correct. Now, let's say you like the API, where the API that Kubernetes provides. You understand the concept of pods and deployments and replica set. And you want to have the ability where you are feared of quote unquote dreaded lock-in, so to say, where you want to have the ability to run an open source project that could run on premises and in the cloud as well. You want to bring that expertise where I could do the dev and test using the API in your local environment and then take that to production on the cloud and yet be able to leverage the same skill set. Kubernetes is a good fit. So essentially open source and the abstraction of the API and the deployment model on how you want to go with it, then EKS is a good fit. So those are sort of the two main ways you're going to look at between ECS and EKS.
Okay, and then where does Fargate come in?
Exactly. Now, with both ECS and EKS, the model is we give you a managed control plane in the sense that, okay, you don't need to worry about how the cluster is provisioned. But in both cases, you still have to bring your own worker nodes in. But that's still undifferentiated heavy lifting for you. In certain cases, you do not care about how the cluster is provisioned. You may want to give just a Docker container and say, go run this container for me. And that's exactly where Fargate fits in. So the idea is you can provision your ECS cluster today, bring your own worker nodes, but that's called as the EC2 mode of the cluster launch. But in cases where you don't care about how the cluster is provisioned, that's the Fargate mode of the cluster launch. So essentially, Fargate is a technology sitting underneath on how your cluster is provisioned or not provisioned. Cluster is still the administrative boundary, but you're not responsible for the EC2 instances. You say, I'm running the ECS cluster in the Fargate mode, in which case you just have a cluster and we manage and maintain and scale the cluster for you automatically. You don't have to bring in any worker nodes. You just give us a container and it runs and we scale for it for you.
Interesting. So what does that do with how you think about pricing when you're using Fargate?
Yeah, well, the key thing to think about, first of all, is at reInvent of 2017, we announced ECS and Fargate integration. So that's available today. We also announced plans for EKS and Fargate integration, and there is some interesting work happening in that area. We can talk about that later. Now, when you are running ECS cluster where you bring your own worker nodes, now you have full control. You can do on-demand, you can do spot, you can do reserve instances. So the prices could really vary depending upon what you are using. With Fargate, what we give you is a big dial. And the dial is essentially how much memory, how much CPU do you want? And the pricing is in per second range with at least 1 minute of pricing. But then after that, it goes like per second billing. So the pricing could be really effective. So if you have a burstable load where you want to do something quickly with containers, Fargate may be a good fit for you.
I was actually thinking that Fargate had a model much more similar to serverless on how it was used. So it is actually per second.
It is very much.
Okay. So as I mentioned, EKS was announced, I think you said June 10th, I believe it was, somewhere around there. So I thought we'd spend some time talking a bit about EKS and kind of dive into kind of what it's all about and what its limitations, what its strengths, and kind of how developers might be able to use EKS from Amazon. So let's kind of go into it first. So you already described what EKS is about. First off, what is the code that's being deployed that is running with EKS? Is it Upstream? Is it a version? How is that managed? What's the code that's running it?
Yeah, one of the core tenets of EKS is upstream compatibility. And that is what we are completely striving for. That is the ultimate goal here. So there is no interior branches for Kubernetes that is going to be maintained. So essentially, what you get with EKS today is when you say provision an EKS cluster, it's a managed control plane. And today it's available in US West 2 and US East 1. Those are the two regions it's available in. And when you say provision an EKS cluster, it gives you a highly available control plane where we provision 3 masters and 3 etcd nodes for you, automatic backup, snapshotting of etcd, scaling of nodes, all that automatically happen for you. So that's a scary part if you have to do this yourself. So it's a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting that we are doing for the customers. That's the good part of it. Now, very much like ECS, you still bring your worker nodes and you say attach that to the EKS control plane. So that's essentially what you get. And then you can use kubectl, which comes as part of Upstream, like say 1.10, which is the version that we just announced. You can take the kubectl from Upstream and use that to deploy your pod manifest or whatever your application manifest to the Kubernetes cluster.
What about plugins and tooling support? Is fully supported? Is there a whitelist?
Because we are managing the control plane for you, so we have taken an opinionated approach in terms of what plugins we enable over there. But because the workers are completely in your domain, so it's run in a split account. The control plane runs in Amazon account, the worker runs in your customer's account. So whatever you want to do as part of the plugins, etc., that you want to install on the worker nodes, you fully have control of that. But because it's a managed control plane, we have the feedback in terms of what plugins and admission controllers, for example, needs to be enabled. And we are constantly listening for customer feedback on that.
I guess what I'm hearing you say, the kind of key differentiator is when you fire this up, you get high availability across 3 different, would you say, availability zones?
Availability zones.
Yeah. So you get that out of the box. You don't have to do that undifferentiated heavy lifting. Because Kubernetes, it's like, I think 50-something% is running Kubernetes on ECS today, right? So, I mean, you already have that. It's just you have to manage that yourself if you're doing it.
But I think one of the things that we didn't talk about is running Kubernetes is not for the faint of the heart. Managing the cluster by yourself. Should I run 1 master or 3 masters? What should the size of my master look like? Should my etcd be co-located with master or separate from master? How should my etcd be sized? How often should I back up it, snapshot it? What if thing goes down? Should it be HA? So those are all the things, and particularly done with the AWS best practices. That's where you were wondering. So even though for the recent survey for CNCF, 57% of Kubernetes runs on AWS, and that's a huge shout out to COPS and other communities that have enabled that truly. So big shout out to them. But still, you still have to understand what are the AWS best practices to get it up and running. And that's exactly the undifferentiated lifting, an opinionated way of running Kubernetes cluster on AWS is what EKS provides.
Yeah, of course. It makes sense. It's anything that's not writing business logic is time away from delivering features, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's see. What's it look like if you're going to bootstrap and deploy an app with EKS? What's this whole process look like?
Yeah, so essentially what you do is you fire up a EKS cluster, you go to the console, you can fire up a EKS cluster, or there is AWS CLI. You can use that to create your EKS cluster. Once the cluster is ready, you got to make sure that the master is provisioned. Then there is a CloudFormation template that you can use that CloudFormation template to bring the worker nodes and attach it to the cluster. So that then your cluster is now ready. And as I said, you just are using Upstream kubectl. The way we have worked is typically if you use kubectl, it uses a configuration on how to connect to the cluster. But in the AWS LAN, our customers expect us to use IAM credentials. So Heptio, is one of our great partners. They built a Heptio AWS authenticator. So we expect you to download that additional dependency. And then using that dependency, you can pass now IAM role by which you can authenticate to the cluster. Once you have authenticated, then the same kubectl can continue to be used to deploy your application. So really, it's the upstream experience. There is no additional kubectl that you need to download, but be aware that the EKS cluster is 110 compliant. And by the way, it is a Kubernetes conformant cluster.
So what about limitations? So you've got ECS, you've got EKS. What about the deep kind of Amazon integrations? Is there a difference between the two? Are they equal citizens, or is there still some work to do in EKS?
Oh, there's definitely work to do in EKS. I mean, anything that we have launched on day one is a good start. And the key part really is we always innovate on customers' behalf. Now, given the fact that ECS has been out here for over 3 years now, it definitely has far more deeper integrations. Things like Code Pipeline, things like CloudWatch, things like CloudTrail. Those are much deeper integrations. But these are some of the items that we are looking very actively on EKS on how we can integrate with them. Again, based upon customer feedback, we're kind of prioritizing what makes sense first, and then we are working on that.
You talked a bit about kind of the shared responsibility when you're deploying on EKS. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so shared responsibility model at AWS, this is a very common concept where we talk about the responsibility of Amazon is for the host operating system, the underlying virtualization layer, and the physical security of the data center. So that's Amazon's responsibility. Anything on top of that, whether it's guest operating system or how your application is deployed, what security groups are exposed, those are customers' responsibility. So in that sense, if you look at the shared responsibility, the control plane is completely Amazon's responsibility because that's what we are taking the ownership of. So if you want to upgrade your cluster, it could be a simple check or it could be a manual process, but then we will take care of the upgrade for you. But on the worker side, if you want to upgrade your cluster, that is still customer's responsibility. But again, we will provide scripts, etc., which will enable you to simply upgrade your cluster to a newer version if you need to.
What are some of the success stories you're hearing with customers out there with EKS?
Yeah, I think one of the cool things that I like about EKS, and in general about Amazon is, the customer obsession here. There were about 60 plus customers that were part of the limited preview. The limited preview was announced at reInvent. GoDaddy, of course, is one of our big success stories. These guys released an article a few weeks back where they're going all in on EKS. And I have a personal story here because I remember me and the PM for the EKS service, Brandon Chavez, we were called in to talk about EKS at GoDaddy. And this was after Satya Nadella kind of pitched in there the day before. So we were told that, you guys got to beat whatever Satya Nadella is doing over there to pitch his Kubernetes version. So we said, okay, we'll do our best. But, a few weeks later, we finally heard that, okay, they actually went with the EKS route. So I'm super excited. There are a lot of customers that we have been working with, so Pearson is a classic example. We have interacted with them in the SIG AWS community in Kubernetes Slack. FICO, Intuit is big into it. Verizon, Trainline, a lot of customers. I would say go to aws.amazon.com/EKS and the customer names are over there. And we are actively working with some of these customers to be able to publish their success stories as well.
So how does EKS and Fargate integration work?
Yeah, so if you look at it, ECS and Fargate is already available today. We announced our intent for EKS and Fargate integration. Now that the EKS is GA, we have started discussions out in the community on what does the concept of Fargate really mean in the Kubernetes land. Now, if you think about it, the entire Kubernetes infrastructure is built around the concept of a node. You have a node, and then you have a node agent, which is kubelet essentially, which is where you can define an affinity of a pod, and if the pod can be deployed on a particular node or not deployed in a particular node. So node is a very central concept essentially. Now, if you look at Fargate, there is no concept of a node, or at least the customers are not aware of the node. So now virtual kubelet is an effort that is out in the community where they are trying to build something similar, like Fargate and out in the open. So we have been partnering with them. What we have done is a virtual kubelet has this concept of a provider. So we sent a pull request to have a Fargate provider over there. Now, remember, this is a very, very early pre-alpha work, and it's only one direction that we are looking at it, possible proof of concept. But the key work really has to happen in the Kubernetes community. So a couple of weeks back, a nodeless working group started basically, where they're starting to talk about what does nodeless mean in terms of Kubernetes. The discussion also needs to happen in the SIG node, SIG architecture, and these are the places where we're engaging in the community. So as I said earlier, one of the core tenets of EKS is upstream compatibility and discussions out in the open. So Amazon is changing in that sense that, we no longer have to discuss this internally, but these decisions have to be made out in transparency mode with the community.
Very nice. What are some of the other stories you have about open source and containers at AWS?
Yeah, totally. As I said, again, one of the core tenets of EKS is open source. Now, if you look at how networking works in Kubernetes, that is done through CNI plugin. So what we have built is, there are about 8 to 10 CNI plugins that you can use from a variety of vendors. Now, customers running on Amazon, they prefer VPC networking. So what we did is we built a CNI plugin out in the open, completely in open source. And that CNI plugin, anybody can use to set up their own Kubernetes cluster, which will give them native VPC networking for their pods. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, if you look at the Heptio authenticator that we were talking about earlier, that's again done with Heptio. These are the tools that allow IAM credentials to authenticate to a Kubernetes cluster. Again, done in the open source with our partners. We talked about virtual kubelet recently. There is, of course, SIG AWS, where we participate quite actively. And actually, Bob Wise, who's a GM for the EKS service, is now one of the SIG leads. So we participate quite actively over there. There is a CoreOS ingress controller, that can be installed as part of EKS. And we are looking at that very closely. So hopefully sometime in the future, we will provide a pre-bundled version of the CoreOS ingress controller as part of EKS. And that is one of the projects that we have moved as a sub-project of SIG AWS so that we can collaborate with our customers, our partners, our developers over there, and then eventually bring it as a managed service for our customers. And last but not the least, there is, of course, Cloud Provider Working Group, where we have been working on to achieve consistency across providers, where the provider-specific code, such as the AWS-specific code, then we are responsible for managing it. By the way, we are very actively hiring engineers. If you want to build your Kubernetes open source career at Amazon, we are actively hiring.
What's the story around the service mesh, such as Istio, Conduit, Envoy, using EKS?
Because you are running a EKS managed control plane, so we define what really goes on that based upon customer feedback. But because you are responsible for the worker nodes, you can define whatever you want on that by yourself. So if Istio can be defined, Istio can be installed, for example, on an EKS cluster, then this will completely work. And as a matter of fact, literally this morning, I was working with a developer advocate on trying to install Istio on an EKS cluster. And as we were identifying issues, what is working, what is not working, we were filing issues in the open source and then also following up with the EKS team to make sure that it works out of the box. So I think those are some of the things that we are definitely actively looking at.
I may have seen some comments on your Twitter feed about this.
Yep.
All right, Arun, let's start wrapping up. So what's up next? What do you have planned for the rest of the year?
Well, lots of events that are coming up. Actually, next week, literally, I'm going to be at LinuxCon, ContainerCon. They call it as LC3 in Beijing. And then I'm speaking at an event in Korea. So I'm excited. Korea is a country that I've never been to. But in addition, of course, reInvent planning has already started. We are looking to be at KubeCon Seattle. Definitely, that's one of the things that we are looking for. That's particularly at Amazon's backyard. So we are looking forward to do that. I'm looking forward to meeting a lot of customers around the world who are running their clusters on EKS and hopefully highlighting their customer stories. Open source is something that I'm truly passionate about. So if any of you customers or developers or partners want to blog about open source on our open source blog property, I'm happy to take those feedbacks.
I know you always have some interesting projects in your back pocket. What are you working on?
Yeah, something that I've been interested on recently is definitely the service mesh concept. On what is the value. It's sometimes very difficult to explain the concept of a pod to a Kubernetes newbie. But the moment you have this concept of a sidecar, that, hey, I can have an Envoy as a sidecar container automatically injected for you in the pod, then there is an aha moment. So I think that's a good part that I really like. And then Envoy is one part of it, but then something like Istio on top of it, on the value that it provides, that's a good part of it. Now, take that a step forward. And that's sort of the area that I've been playing around with, is around chaos engineering. What is chaos engineering about? And how do you disrupt your systems ahead of time proactively so that, in production, when you go into production, the systems are more resilient? So how do you marry, for example, chaos engineering, Istio, and Kubernetes together to build resilient applications? So that's one of the areas that I've been paying attention to recently, and I'm excited about it.
Very cool. It's definitely a hot area. Well, Arun, it's always great to catch up with you. I look forward to seeing you very soon at a KubeCon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.